Welcome back to Strange Exiles, a podcast about ideas, identity, and ideology. I'm your host, Bram E. Gieben, and today I'm going to be speaking to two comrades who I work with over at Revol Press, and whose work is extremely interesting, covering the worlds of art, literature, poetry, fiction, and more. First of all, we have Adam Turl, an artist and writer from Southern Illinois, and author of the book Gothic Capitalism, Art Evicted from Heaven and Earth. Adam is also a member of the Southern Illinois Democratic Socialists of America. And Adam's partner is Tish Turl. They are a writer, artist, and poet, and author of the serialized novella Sound, as well as an ongoing poetry series with a wonderful title, The Toilet Key Anthology, and the Franken Prose Poetry Project, Stink Ape Resurrection Primer. I hope I got that right. Together, they are co-organizers of the Born Again Labor Museum, an ongoing visual and conceptual art project and DIY community organizing space. And they're both editors at Locust Review, part of the Locust Arts and Letters Collective, which is a loose association of radical, critical, irrealist, and socialist artists. Adam and Tish, welcome to the show.
Thank you for having us.
Thanks.
Brilliant. We got to have you on together. It's a rare treat. So let's kick off a little bit.
We're never together.
No, this is good. I think it's actually the first time I've had a duo on the show as well. So yeah, hopefully this goes okay. But you're both coming through okay, so that's good. So yeah, I thought we might kick things off by talking a little bit about your backgrounds and sort of the paths that you followed to get into writing, making art, and organizing. Did you both do this kind of from a young age?
Oh, gosh. Yes, I've been writing for like as long as I can remember. I wrote my first poem when I was like 6, and obviously it wasn't very good, but I was really hooked on putting words together in a way that impressed other people. And then, of course, because I've always been a nerd, that immediately became writing fan fiction and for a long time editing fan fiction for other people. So it never paid the bills, but it did make sure that I was eating more than just lentils a lot of the time. So that was cool. But yeah, I've been writing for as long as I can because I can't not do it. Yeah.
Was there a particular kind of canon that you were into with the fan fiction?
Disappointingly, most of what I wrote was Harry Potter fan fiction.
That was one of the big ones, wasn't it?
I'm really solidly a millennial, so I mean that was But I mean, I also oh gosh, this is even more millennial. I mean, I edited Hentelia fan fiction, which is like the countries that it's just like the head is a flag and that character is a country. Really weird, supernatural stuff like that. So, but it was really a lot of continuity and copy editing of Harry Potter fan fiction.
That's really interesting. I think a lot of people in that millennial cohort got into writing through fan fiction. And obviously there are lots of examples of people who then turned that into publishing deals and so on. But, you know, your work's taken a kind of left turn into writing for kind of political platforms and so on. So did that happen, as a sort of quite naturally? Did you find your way to writing different kinds of things?
Well, I think the thing is about fan fiction that like about 70% of it is self-insert wish fulfillment. So it tends to be really romantic. And I was writing a lot of the stuff with a lot of the people on the fringes who were weird, who were just breaking the stories. We were writing things like crack fix, which is a really deeply unfortunate term now, but it's just nonsense, you know? It's just stuff that takes place in a single universe, but it's nonsense. You're just pushing the boundary of what you can actually create and have it still make sense. I just found that like I was talking more about the world and what I was writing anyway than interpersonal relationships and romance and things like that. So I've just been pulled constantly by, I think, my general rage at the government towards talking about that in every way that I possibly can. Yeah.
So that's interesting. So it sounds like your work kind of started out experimental and sort of became more and more political. Was it similar for yourself, Adam? Like your roots as an artist, did you start out political, or did you find your way
Oh
there gradually?
no, no. Like most people who get into visual art, you know, I drew constantly. I was an only child. My dad was the American Baptist campus minister at Southern Illinois University, and my mom was a high school teacher. I was only child, so I would spend hours like, you know, in the corner of my dad's church or my mom's classroom, drawing and reading and stuff like that. So I developed all this like internal monologue and discussion around things, and it was like as a kid, it was a lot of like fantasy and science fiction. I would read comic books, and then I got the chance to go to the Kunsthalle in Stuttgart when I was a teenager, and then I would religiously go to the St. Louis Art Museum and got sort of obsessively interested in art history and visual art. But I wasn't super political. I went to some protests against the Gulf War and against clear cutting of the Shawnee National Forest, and I was, left of center and everything. But it was really working a real job, in between taking classes at the Art Institute in Chicago. I was working at this place called Market Facts, back when there were still call centers in the U.S. doing market research, and it was highly exploitative. I had, coworkers who were taking hour-long commutes from the south side of Chicago to Evanston, Illinois, to call people and ask them about their soda preferences and their health insurance and what brand of cigarettes they smoked. And the only people who could make a living at it were the top 10% of callers every month because we got bonuses. And I usually got a bonus, but not always. And it would throw your whole month into chaos if you didn't get into the top 10% and get your bonus. And I had read the Communist Manifesto in high school because, intellectually curious. But I read the Communist Manifesto on my breaks at Market Facts, and it all just crystallized in my head. And I started moving even farther to the left, and also started seeing the contradictions in the art world. Like, yeah, it's great that like anything can be art, and there's all this interesting stuff happening, but why is everybody pretty much rich? Why doesn't anybody else have to work at Market Facts in addition to their job as a gallery receptionist, which is a job I also had that didn't really pay anything much. And so you start to ask these questions, and then the war in Kosovo happened. And I remember very clearly on my way to work at Market Facts, I stopped at this diner, which was a thing I did pretty much every day. And I would read like the New York Times and the Chicago Sun-Times and the Chicago Tribune every morning. And I'm reading the New York Times, and there's an article about how we had to bomb Serbia to stop the refugee crisis in Kosovo. And in the same article, it explained that the refugee crisis in Kosovo was largely caused by the United States bombing Serbia. And that was the last straw for me. I'm like, this is too much of an obvious contradiction. So I started like finding socialists to organize with and stuff like that. And I'd like to say I immediately brought the politics into my artwork, but I became very focused on political organizing. I got a job as a typesetter for a socialist newspaper. I ended up being an organizer full time for a number of years. And it was only after doing that for a number of years I started to bring the politics and the art together in a more sustained kind of way. But, basically, it's like you draw something as a child and an adult says, that's really cool. And you're like, I want more affirmation,
Yep.
And this is great because I didn't know it yet, but I had anxiety disorder. I could make a drawing and then they could praise it. And I didn't have to, they didn't have to be there while I was actually doing it.
Oh, that's really interesting. I also spent some time in the kind of, the call center mines in the late 90s and early 2000s. And I think that is a very alienating form of labor, especially if you're doing that like cold calling, marketing stuff. And those jobs were also very insecure, as much as there were a lot of them around, you could easily lose your job or, get fired for some minor infraction. I'm not sure that it maybe politicized me quite as directly, but I definitely wrote a couple of poems about sort of like how terrible it was to work in call centers. So I can sympathize there.
The market research wasn't as bad as I did have briefly a job in telemarketing where we sold magazine subscriptions, and it was in this sort of vague office building out by the airport. And the magazine subscription cost less than you if you bought them on the stand, but it was way more than if you just got a subscription normally, with the magazine. And I'm pretty sure it was a mob front. My boss would sit in his office. He was this older guy, and he would smoke cigarettes on the long filter, like he was like, I don't know, Cruella de Vil. And then his son would walk through us and say stuff like, "Us against them, boys, make things happen." And there were framed pictures of money and Rolls Royces on the wall, and they violated all the rules. You were encouraged to like chain smoke and drink coffee the whole time. If you sold less than 4 of these a day, and each one was $750, and that's in 90s money, you were fine. But if you sold less than 4, they wouldn't fire you, but they would bully you until you didn't come back. And every day after work, everybody would get drunk and high in the parking lot before going home because it was so awful and traumatic. I remember this one guy would lie to everybody, whoever he called. He was from their hometown, and he'd be like, "Where'd you live? Which side of the tracks did you live on?" And then, like, judging from like that, he could like make up the next lie, And by the end, he would sell, fucking like Cosmo and L subscriptions to some unsuspecting person who didn't know enough. That it was terrible. I only lasted 2 months, and I was impressed that I lasted that long because anyway.
Gosh, that almost sounds like the kind of telemarketing version of the Wolf of Wall Street. Some similarities there.
Like a poor man's Glengarry Glen Ross.
yeah, absolutely. I think like one of the jobs I had doing, I'm not sure if it was sales or inbound calls. I can't remember now, but all of the rewards that you got in lieu of bonuses, and again, it was a very small wage because you got these rewards. Were all like vouchers for businesses.
Oh God!
So it was this idea of like being part of a capitalist matrix. I definitely kind of got that vibe from my involvement with the call center industry there. It's interesting. I wonder how many people were radicalized by call centers. It's probably not a small number. So tell me a little bit about the subject matter of what you do now, Tish. We heard some of the brilliant titles that you use for your work now. What would you say is kind of like your Venn diagram of what you like to write about now?
Honestly, especially with Stinkape, the thing that I've been writing little vignettes about are like the breaking point that people have, and whether it's a small breaking point or a large breaking point, I'm really fascinated with that. And I think politically, it's really obvious why I'm fascinated with that, because I'm like wondering when the fuck our breaking point's going to come, each one of us, because my God, there have been so many moments where I thought it should have, and every day. But I just keep having these, I keep writing these little vignettes of characters just reaching this moment where enough is enough, and whatever small act they can do, whether it's I have a character who like goes into a VR video game and shoots up a bunch of landlords that are hanging out together in the video game, because all she can really do is just troll them, like make their lives difficult in that venue, right? Or like I just finished the draft of my novel Sound, and that, like, my first conception of that was sort of like one big explosive moment and then a tumbling fight, and then the revolution is over. And I've written Sound, and I read Revolutionary Rehearsals, which is a book about 5 different attempted revolutions, and then I read chapter 4 of
Trotsky's History of the Russian Revolution.
And
about the Tsar and Tsarina and
and that completely changed the way that I wanted to write that. But I think I'm going to be stuck with writing like weird little fan fiction of moments of whether one person or a small group of people just have to break something because they're done being exploited and oppressed and they can't take it anymore. I'm having what is that the network, right? I'm mad as hell and I can't take it anymore.
Mm.
I watched that when I was 16, and that's been ringing in my head probably since then. So that's probably part of it.
Yeah, absolutely. So it sounds like, you're almost trying to find the point of rupture there.
Yes.
Where people sort of rupture with capitalism and with hyper exploitation. Would that be fair to say?
Oh yeah, yeah. I actually just kind of wrote a piece about fan fiction and the value that it has had in helping me really zero in on my fascination with the moment of rupture and what it's going to take for us and all the different ways that we experience it every day, toppling towards when we're finally over it, I guess.
There's a line you use in the draft, and it's like a draft of an essay for Spectre journal, right? I think it's like micro rebellions or micro insurrections. That there's the large moments of conflict, but there's also these small moments that make up ultimately the larger moments. And one of the things that's interesting about that, because you apply your theory of, you apply fan fiction, which you downplay the fact people would pay you to edit their fan fiction, including their disturbing / fiction about supernatural.
There's a lot of it,
but you take that, and there's some academic discussion for a number of years now about how fan fiction is the audience asserting its control over these narratives.
Mm-hmm.
And you sort of describe capitalism as like the ultimate failed canon. The narratives of capitalism are themselves a failed story. Like here in the U.S., we have the Horatio Alger myth, based on these terrible novels that were written by a disgraced priest who probably molested people, but it was always who went to Harvard, and these were from the 1800s, and they were early 90s, and they were mostly about plucky young men who, despite being poor, through determination, grit, luck, hard work, become wealthy and whatever. And that's just baked into everyday American life. This story, and of course that story fails the vast majority of people because it has to, right? So the aggressions that and the rebellions that your realist characters have against these kinds of constraints are, I think, just sort of class revenge fan fiction is what you call it.
Yeah, no, that's interesting. I mean, it's quite an interesting, this is a total digression here, but it's quite an interesting contrast between Harry Potter fan fiction and supernatural fan fiction. So I mean, Harry Potter, if you think about it, it's a very, very hierarchical world. It draws on a lot of tropes of kind of British class society and things like that. Whereas Supernatural, you've got these two people who are sort of, doing a very strange job that not a lot of people understand. They live on the margins of society. I'm definitely not immune to the charms of Sam and Dean. I've got to say, I really enjoyed that show when it was on.
It was a good show, yeah.
Yeah, two underwear models solve spooky crimes. I'm into it.
Well,
yeah.
Especially the first 5 seasons, which has a very tight arc, and there's good stuff later, but it's like narrative chaos.
I didn't write a lot of supernatural fan fiction. I edited supernatural fan fiction, and that was mostly because as an editor, I could charge more. And that's because, like Adam said, like people got really weird with it, and so you could charge like $30 a page to edit what's called wincest, which is those underwear. Yeah, right. So I mean, I would really not take those very often, but if you're hard up, $45 a page is $45 a page. So.
And that was like 15, 20 years ago.
Right. So. Yeah,
some interesting parallels there, nonetheless. So I wanted to ask a little bit about kind of Locust Review. So this has obviously been a project that's been quite central to what you've been doing for the last few years. How did you get involved? Were you two of the founders of Locust Review?
I mean, yeah, it was us and Alex, right? We kind of
Well, also Mike Lineweaver,
right?
Holly
Mike Lineweaver, Holly,
Mike up the poet in Texas. And Holly Lewis is a philosopher and a professor who actually focuses on technology, but is well known for writing a comparative philosophy of Marxism, queer theory, and feminist theory called "The Politics of Everybody." Which is
and Newcomb came in early enough that I would give him honorary founders.
Yeah, Newcomb joined right after the first issue. We met up with the Newcomb Roy who's an artist in India and a member of the Communist Party of India, Marxist-Leninist Liberation, which is like this Communist Party that's most focused on grassroots struggle and really takes seriously the caste issue in addition to class struggle and other issues of oppression. And we met up with Anupam in London in 2019, right after the first issue came out. And then he joined the editorial collective too. And then Adam Marks, who's a writer who lives in Wales, and then later on, April McIntyre, who's a comrade out in Olympia, Washington, and Laura Fair Schultz, who's an upstate New York. So there's a number of people, anyway.
But yeah, we're there from the beginning.
Yeah, we started it. I was teaching in Las Vegas, and we went to Los Angeles to our friend Alexander Billett, who's a writer and a theorist who wrote a book about music and neoliberalism in the city called Shake the City. That's really good. And it's going to have a new edition coming out. It was just published in Portuguese. We went out to meet up with him and his partner. Now they're married. And we went to his partner's house and hung out at her parents' pool and figured out the first issue. And the idea, we've been doing this thing called Red Wedge, which was sort of a Marxist regroupment cultural website, and also occasionally printed materials. And it was the idea of that was just after Occupy and the Arab Spring and the Black Lives Matter coming out of St. Louis, it was around that time, and the fights around blue race. We're there's this new left developing, and art can't just be reduced to politics, but it's political. So we're going to look at all the different strands of left and progressive and emancipatory and Marxist cultural history and have discussions about it and see what we can use for our own work. As artists, art historians, and writers that were part of Red Wedge. And that was throughout the 2010s. So we would look at epic theater or theater of the oppressed in Brazil. We would look at, we had dancers writing articles and visual artists and poets and art historians of different kinds. And then we started thinking about more specific strategies, which really focused in on Mark Fisher and the ideas of capitalist realism, the fact that there was this stultification of imagination born of capitalist realism. And then we were looking at Michel Louis and Michel Louis' ideas of critical realism. How can you disrupt that lack of belief in alternatives in some way? And that was sort of the two things that came together. For a brief time, we had a critical and realist discussion group that was Alex Billett, Tish, and I, and Holly Lewis, to talk about what can we do with this, And then eventually we decided to move on from Red Wedge and start Locust Review, which initially was going to be quarterly, but it was more 3 times a year. Now it's 2 times a year, but it's much larger. Initially, it was really focused on practice, so lots of visual art, writing, poetry. It still is, but we're putting more nonfiction in and more theory as well now. We've kind of doubled the size of the issue, but we're only putting out twice a year now. But we are putting up things on the website and stuff like that. So, but it's been a place to and it's gone up and down with the social movements. It was up and away for a few years. But now with the confusion around Trump 2.0 and also the inflation and the aimlessness of the radical center being back in charge under Biden, and the hard political questions that were we had people who are editors who ended up leaving over our criticism of Israel.
Right.
We had people who left over other matters of oppression and injustice and so on. So, so it's fluctuated with and against the moment, right? Too. But
I mean, the aesthetic of the magazine is really great. I mean, obviously, it takes some cues from sort of traditional zine culture, from agitprop and from all sorts of different kind of DIY aesthetics. Was that kind of your guiding hand, kind of bringing those different influences together, Adam? Did you want it to look a particular way?
Yeah. We wanted it to have a sense of a chaotic or differentiated totality or the carnivalesque, a feeling that it's lots of people's voices there and aesthetics and viewpoints, and together that creates something different. And that was definitely the main emphasis for the first few years. There's like now that we're putting a little bit more nonfiction and theory in, like we're like going back and forth between like a somewhat more readable journal format and the chaotic totality of it. But yeah, that was the idea. And the idea was also to have something that you could hold in your hand, because everything had become so digital. And it's not like against the digital. We use computers to make it, right? Yeah. Although we also cut things up, scan them, put them into the computer, but like, to have a sense that there's a fetish aspect to the object, not in a commodity fetish sense, but in like, the earlier understanding of the word fetish. It's like a totemic sort of object, but
yeah. And now in terms of the editorial policy, do you have like a fairly established core group of people who contribute, or are you always looking for new contributors? So you kind of like trying to open it up to as wide a group of people as possible?
I think we have people who consistently send us stuff. Our phase immediately comes to mind. His My Body series, that's lived in Locust, and I hope that it always does until it becomes, I don't know, a novel or something, because the guy is brilliant. We have a lot of people that submit in a core group, but I think we're also always like just reaching out, who jives with what we're saying, who is like inspired by it and wants to add. So yeah, I like knowing that we have the same group of people, like comrades, that are really understand Locust and want to be a part of it. But I also like that we have people who see it and are like, yeah, I want to put something in that. That's really cool.
Yeah. It's a couple of our editorial comrades started putting our stuff on all the different literature submission stuff.
Yeah.
And so we would get submissions, people had clearly no clue,
right,
what the journal was. And so that got to be a little bit much, because we get like submissions that is obviously, here's a basically heterosexist narrative about a manly guy in the woods. It's like, that's not going to fit, like with us at all. I can read it, I'm like, is there like social class or anything in here? No, there's nothing. Or anything weird going to happen? No, nothing weird is going to happen. It's just, okay, you had a feeling in the woods one day, it made you feel like a man. Nobody else cares.
In fact, nothing happens until something awful.
Yeah, and then it's something sexist. Anyway, so we want more people, but also we want it to like, go with the direction we want to go into, like going against capitalist realism and people. And that doesn't always have to be political, but it has to have some kind of a real edge that could be. And like I said, there's been a little bit of a narrowing because of the reaction in the United States, which isn't just the fascist types and the right wing and lunacy, or the fact that we just stopped spending government money on the vaccines that, saved most of us from COVID, right? Which just happened. And it's absolute lunacy. It's also on a molecular level where people are hiding more. People are not as upfront about their political beliefs, or just like making like what you could almost like micro concessions to the new order of things. So that's having an impact. And I think that means we have to be even more conscious of what we're putting in the journal and on the website, to cut against that in a way that doesn't cut us off from people. At the same time, our phase does this series, Tish was saying, the My Body series, and it starts off with a story. I think it was called "I Live an Hour from My Body," and the narrator is having this beef with his material body, because his material body is doing drugs and sabotaging his job and hates everything that's wrong in the world, but is acting in an irresponsible manner. Sets fire to some guy's car, and like all this stuff, and then learns how to astral project to, and the narrator isn't sure if this is true, astral project to kill his political enemies. And so the narrator's like, is he really doing that? If he is that morally okay? Or is he crazy? And it's a brilliant story, and it's been in like every issue since issue 3, I think.
Yeah.
Is another installment of this guy basically arguing with his own body.
Yeah.
This working class guy who moves from job to job in the Inland Empire in California, which is the desert before you get to Los Angeles.
As someone who has experienced dissociation pretty consistently due to anxiety and depression, there's one element in that story that really sticks with me, and it's when he's referring to his body, he's always angry, and he always calls it the idiot. And it's like, as I really just appreciate the poetic honesty that exists in the way that he describes the relationship between the mind and the body, the different interests that they have, even though they have really the same interests. It's a wonderful, wonderful series.
Well, it brings up all the stuff about bifurcation of self under capitalism, who you have to be at work versus who you are when you're not exploited,
right?
Or Du Bois' idea of double consciousness.
Yeah.
Amongst Black Americans, you're American, but you're also Black. That means you have to perform one, basically a kind of code switching, or like observations of what life was like under the Eastern Bloc, where you had to perform one version of yourself for the state, and then there's who you could be at your kitchen table, right? So, and he breaks that down in this way, and you go back and forth between sympathizing with the narrator and sympathizing with the body.
It's really excellent. Yeah.
Also, is the narrator a reliable narrator, which is a whole other part.
No, that's great. I mean, I think like Locust is a really important project, I think, because it's difficult to hold space for experimental or transgressive or just, plain downright weird writing. There aren't a lot of places that do that now. I mean, if you think back, like we had writers like Pynchon, Thomas Pynchon, despite some of the dodgy politics, William S. Burroughs, you'd struggle to think of sort of equivalent figures like that in fiction now that sort of get the light in the mainstream. So I think it's really important that places like Locust Review hold space for the type of experimental writing you're describing. Philip K. Dick, for instance, there's a writer who's in enormous commercial potential these days, but in his day was struggling to get those kind of weird concepts across.
Right.
So yeah, it's funny. Things have become a lot less experimental in the mainstream, or in the sort of visible mainstream, I guess. Yeah. No, that's.
It makes me think of my students and how unwilling and unable they are to experiment or be wrong. I feel like that's just socially something that's been reinforced for us so much so that it's going to be a real problem with the next generations, because if you can't be wrong, you can't innovate. If you can't make mistakes, if you're so petrified about the quality of your performance in daily life, you're not really living. And that's really sad to me. And it's also really scary for what's going to happen to art and writing and just everything in general,
Yeah, it's hard to get across like the idea, which I really believe to sometimes my students, it's better to make something that's bad yourself than make something that's good that's not what you want to make.
Right.
Which is related to the pressure, I think, around generative AI.
Yeah.
Like, it's actually better to express yourself poorly than turn in something that looks like it's good. But I also think it's related to the disappearance of like sort of like third spaces. Like we talk about that in the physical world.
Yeah.
But it's also a cultural process more generally. Like the small journals that didn't make a lot of money, but allowed Walter Benjamin to write for a while, because Benjamin was never really part of academia, right? But was able to write. Or the kind of like pulp press that allowed spaces for people like Dick, but also were influenced heavily by the Michaelists and the Futurists, who had been young Communist Party members in New York City during the Great Depression, who left the party largely after the Stalin-Hitler Pact because they were rightly disgusted, but were influenced by these radical Marxist ideas written down by one of the members, John D. Michael, and had a plan to take over science fiction for communism. And some of them became really important editors, like Frederick Pohl. Who was it that moved to Canada?
Judith Merrill.
Judith Merrill.
Right.
who was like probably one of the most important science fiction writers and editors in the post-war period in Canada. And a lot of the critical science fiction we think of in the pulp press was influenced by these like communist ideas from the 1930s.
Asimov followed them around like he really wanted to be in their club, and they just kind of thought Asimov was a dork. Well, and Asimov, he was, and he admitted that later. But I mean, it shows you that like Asimov, which is the name everyone knows, is someone who influenced science fiction, was following these people around like a fanboy.
So, and a lot of these kind of spaces have been minimized. I mean, anybody can put something on the internet, but like the sort of economy of its social relations are just mediations by capitalist platforms. So it's kind of like the example, like punk zines in the 70s, 80s, and early 90s. You go to the record store or the coffee shop, and you want to find out what bands are doing in DC, and you live in Portland or whatever. That's how you find out about the bands in DC, and that's sort of curated and intentional with human relationships in this like, liminal space that is definitely not emancipated from capital, but also isn't at the end of the day just about capital. And there's less and less and less of that. So I think that impacts the ability of the culture to sustain some of these indeterminate things. Like, it's either, a giant Marvel movie or nothing, or it's either you're an artist at the Saatchi galleries. I don't even know if this still exists anymore, or you're on Etsy, like the middle spaces have been progressively scratched, along with the disappearance of like, here the polarization of retail between like the only malls that survived the last 20 years of online are the ones for really rich people and really poor people. The ones for people in the middle, just gone.
Funnily enough, if you look at literary fiction these days, the trend is sort of auto-fiction. So, stuff that's directly about the person's life. And, that can be done in a political way, but you don't see a lot of the people who do it in a political way finding a large mainstream audience. You'll find them self-publishing or with small presses. So I think what you're saying is definitely true. But I mean, the other big project that you're both involved in is the Born Again Labor Museum. And every time we speak, Adam, I'm always immensely impressed by this range of prints and beautiful bits of art that are hanging up behind you. And I know that the Born Again Labor Museum in some ways sort of acts as a gallery space for some of your work. Is that how it began, or did you sort of have a plan for it to be a community project first? Maybe you could tell me a little bit about what the Born Again Labor Museum is for the listeners.
Yeah, that was the kind of plan from the beginning, to have it be an art space where we make work, show work, maybe share other people's work if we can, and also have it be a community space. This was, both about like the political questions of the world, but also about like the problems with contemporary art, where in contemporary art, like the art world, institutionalized art world, these in real life interactions, which could be good or bad, or objects and gestures, which could be good, whatever. But it's a rarefied space, right? And if you look at all the studies in the U.S. focus on race and gender and so on historically, but it skews very white and male. Even though the majority of people like in art schools are women, so that's a contradiction. If you look at the studies in UK and Europe, they do take account class. and the people who make up the art world are overwhelmingly from the middle and upper classes, and that's probably true here too. So it's a rarefied space, and there's been studies showing that a lot of working class people won't even walk into an art gallery because they feel like it's an alien space, right? And then the art world has also been dealing with this crisis of substitutability that Ben Davis, the art critic, will just talk about because of digital media, but now AI itself, right? Like where you have generative AI producing images and artworks and so on, and this is undermining some of the few areas where working class people or artists could make a living in illustration, copywriting, and so on. And then the role art has played in gentrification in cities like Los Angeles and most cities that have a critical mass of people, less so in cities that are deindustrialized and don't have another industry to take hold. But artists play this role in gentrification. And we were living in Las Vegas, and I remember I was on a panel in LA with people talking about art and gentrification. Mm-hmm. And this was at the time of protests because all the art galleries in Los Angeles had moved to Boyle Heights, an historically working class Mexican-American neighborhood. And people in the neighborhood were protesting the art galleries. Mm. And so I asked, can you make artwork that's anti-capitalist and show in an art gallery that's subjectively and anchored by real estate capital to remove working class people from a neighborhood? And that went back to Benjamin. That idea of the cult performance of the art object, everything around the art object or gesture is part of its meaning. And he looks at religious ceremonies and the church and the procession around icons and altars, or a book of hours where you pray at particular times. Everything around the object is part of its meaning. And that's true of art in an art gallery as well, right? It's, the context shapes the meaning. It's why watching a movie on your phone is different than going to a movie theater that was built in the late 1930s and watching it with 500 people in a beautiful ornate ballroom type thing. It's a different meaning. The movie can be the same, but it's not the same, right? Mm. So, and then I've been looking at epic theater, some stuff Alan Badiou talked about in terms of the theatrical and politics, Brecht's idea of epic theater, and the idea of interrupting belief, alienation and disruption, but also constructing it through traditional tropes in the theater as well as interrupting it. And I'm like, the art space is a theatrical space. This is why people have moved towards social practice art. The problem with most social practice art is it's just basically charity or just literal interactions. Well, the problem is I can't dictate what the social performance around our work should be. I should just be one voice amongst many that has a social practice around the gestures and objects and so on we make. So the way to do that is, in part, we thought, invite people to use the space for their own self-organizing, located in a place where it's not going to contribute to gentrification, because that's not possible here. No. As much as our city council thinks it is, they are wrong. Have people come from the Starbucks to talk about organizing a union, have people talk about what's the next place we can organize a union, organize around reproductive rights after Roe v. Wade gets overturned and we lose, because our town is in a quote unquote blue state, and we have multiple reproductive rights clinics and gender affirming care clinics. So how can we organize to protect the people coming to our town for those services from the reactionaries who their Confederate ancestors want the laws to follow people they disagree with to other states. So a lot of this went together, and then also the concepts of outsider art, which is a problematic category, art that isn't oriented primarily on the art world. It's not that it'd be great if the St. Louis Art Museum, which we go to regularly, it's like a palace to me, although I hate a lot of what's going on there. It'd be great if they have some of my work. I'm not going to say no to that. I'm an art. Yeah. I'm a vainglorious art bastard. I know that. But the meaning of the work, it's more important what the people around me get out of it, if they get something out of it, than just having it float somewhere in space. So it all fed together. Is that an accurate summary?
That feels right.
Felt rambly. I felt rambly. I
You
haven't had
always feel
enough
rambly and you're not rambly.
I
so
need
don't worry
more
about it.
caffeine.
One thing that struck me about it, I mean, maybe I'm misinterpreting here. I'm no expert on art history, but it was almost a sense of it being a situationist project where it was about taking that art also out into the streets. I guess it's fair to say art as protest is part of Born Again Labor Museum, and there's elements of it that almost sort of mirror propaganda. I can see as well that you've helped people make art to take part in protests, and is that an important part of it, like helping people not just make art or find space to think about art, practice art, but also to take it out into the world and show it as part of that world, intervene, so to speak.
Yeah, I mean, I think one of the really remarkable things about meeting Adam for me was that I was one of those people that I felt like art was unapproachable, and it's not for. I grew up on a farm, and we did not have a lot, and I just thought like, oh, that's middle class people stuff. That's not for that's not for people like me. And then I met Adam and very quickly realized that that's not true. And then through the project of Born Again Labor Museum, it's been really nice to give other people the sort of same feeling that it's actually for us, and it just to remind people that art, like writing, is a part of all of us. It's a human thing, and it does many different things, but it is just as much theirs as it is some asshole who's in a white cube somewhere.
I hope I'm sending out a couple things to galleries right now. I hope they didn't see. No, I'm just kidding. I don't part of the social aspect of it is by allowing community groups and left and labor stuff to use the space for meetings and so on, and to make protest signs and things like that. That we have the world, the social relations intervening in the art space, but then we also have projects that intervene artistically in the world, and we make stuff for protests sometimes and so on, and signs for organizing meetings and things like that.
Yeah.
But some of the big ways are these realist gestures we do. Like we saw, it was just earlier during the pandemic, we saw the signs for call whatever for get a free Bible, so you can get saved or whatever.
Yeah.
Well, let's do that with Communist Manifesto. So we put up signs all around town saying call. We set up a 1-800 number, call and get a free Communist Manifesto. If you live in Southern Illinois, we had to make that clear. We weren't sending Communist Manifestos to the entire planet because we don't have the money to do that. But and then we also put up historical, realist historical markers, some of which were based on our theories or Tish's writing, Tish wrote a vignette as part of Stink Ape Resurrection Primer about somebody who goes through a themed drive-through restaurant called, what was it, Woody's Tromper Palace, and they order all the themed bullshit food, and this sort of sculpture of a beaver that's operating as the speaker sends an electric shock to their body, which makes them immortal. And it was called Immortality Beaver. Yeah. And it turned out it was actually a time-traveling device from a future communist society that was resurrecting all the oppressed people and exploited people from the past. So we made up a sign outside an abandoned fast food restaurant that said, future home of the Immortality Beaver. And then, so we do stuff like that too. Again, cut against, it's a realist psychogeography. So, right. It's like situation it's like combining the two aspects of situationism in a way to read into them all. So it's here's the remixing of the culture while you're flaneuring your way through our town. And the only people who flaneur their way through our town are working class and poor people, because public transit is a joke in the United States and everything's built for cars with capitalism and so on. So it's for other working class people. And then we also made realist protest signs. The idea was that we would have a library for those, and people loved them and would take them. But obviously there's no practical use for them. So we made one based on Tish's concept that all the anti-time travel tropes in speculative fiction are bourgeois because they don't want us to go back in time and undo, the enclosures and colonialism and all the horrible shit they did, slavery. So really, that's just a mythology to keep us from going back in time and stopping the capitalists and the colonialists and the racists. So we made one that said there's nothing wrong with time travel, and then we made one based on your poem "Giving Up," which was about like handing a customer change when you were working at the Shell station in Las Vegas and deciding to give up, but then having to like steel yourself to give up every day because capitalism wants you to care about this bullshit. So we made a protest sign that said "Choose to give up every day."
It's also one that says subsidized soy consumption, which is one of my favorites as well.
Right.
Because of the idea that soy is like feminizing everyone, soy boys.
Soy boys, yeah.
Yeah. So
of course, like that art historian Laurel Fredrickson, she's like, but soy consumption is subsidized. You're not getting getting the gay joke here.
It was a little too niche, but it was
like the anti.
It's a damn good song.
No, I love all that stuff, and I think the time travel stuff in particular really struck a chord with me. I love that idea that like the rules of fictional time travel are bourgeois, and we need to reclaim it for the revolution. It's always about going back in time to kill Hitler. What about if it's going back in time to start a revolution? I really like that idea. I think that has some legs.
It makes me think of. I mean, everyone probably had to read it in school. The Sound of Thunder. I'm struggling to remember the author. Oh God! But the time travel as like a vacation, and the guy goes back, steps on a moth, comes back in the future, and everyone is stupid, and it's fascism now. And it's like you look out the window, and we didn't need for time travel to exist for that to happen. So clearly, if I could go back in time, I know I would fix some shit, and I know a lot of people personally would go back and they would fix really specific shit that would make things a lot better. So
if you could only go back to the 20th century. You go back, stop the degeneration of the Russian Revolution, maybe help Rosa Luxemburg start a separate party earlier, stop the Hungarian comrades from thinking they didn't have to give the peasants anything. Maybe that would, I don't know, But if you go back, then it gets really hard, right? Like, where do you go? How far we go back to fix things?
Yeah.
But
this is why we need an army of working class people going back to fix individual things.
Tish has written this series of things, and like these are all great that can become things that unto themselves. Like on the trope of Go Back and Kill Baby Hitler, where time travelers go back, get people who became monsters for capitalism or whatever. Like get them before they turn really terrible, or re-educate them, and then make them go back and kill themselves before they get
right. It's sort of like as a multiverse. They go back and they get the best version of that person, and then they show them what they did across all of their timelines, and to redeem themselves. And actually, because this is like the personal pruning of constantly like maintaining decency within yourself, right? I feel like a lot of people actually lack that quality. And so what if you could force Elon Musk to go back and kill himself as a baby over and over again until he realized what an asshole he's been?
And then once he gets rid of all the evil versions of himself, then he can enter society in an egalitarian, post-capitalist, democratic society that has achieved immortality like the Russian cosmos believed. That's a whole other thing with Nikolai Fedorov, the Moscow librarian who influenced the early Russian avant-garde, as well as the early Soviet avant-garde, as well as early Soviet rocket scientists and doctors and so on, about this idea that the common task of humanity should be conquering death.
Yeah, it's interesting. I wasn't sure where all this conversation was going to go today, but the rehabilitation of billionaires through time traveling assassinations was not on my bingo card. I'm glad we made it there. No, I mean, I think it's really fascinating to hear you talk about this, like the way that the art project and the protest are or can be the same thing. It makes me think of some stuff we saw in the UK this week, where hundreds of people were arrested for making signs in support of Palestine action. Right. So they were arrested for literally sitting on the streets and making placards with a biro and a piece of card. It's really quite dystopian, I think, to think that's the level that we're at. And obviously, you mentioned the current situation with the second Trump administration. Has that brought down any consequences upon you and the Born Again Labour Museum so far, or do you have any fears that that might happen? I mean, something like giving out free communist manifestos could itself be something that maybe local Trumpites might find challenging. Have you had any fallout or pushback?
So the worst thing we've had in related specifically to the Free Communist Manifestos was some doofy drunk frat boy calling us and being like, and just making noises into the phone and calling us assholes. And that's whatever. We haven't really, knock on wood, fingers crossed, had anything like that, anything worse than that happen. I'm always aware because Carbondale, where we live, where the Born Again Labor Museum is in Carbondale, is a bubble. It's a really nice little liberal and more than liberal bubble surrounded by towns that, if they could be, some of them would still be sundown towns.
Yeah.
There's real animosity and rage outside of Carbondale for Carbondale.
Although it's uneven because a lot of
Yes.
the young working class queer people who all of a sudden move to Carbondale,
Right.
This is where you come,
Yeah.
and there's
This is where
also
you come to work.
and also there's a history of tension between like the conservative and reactionary in Southern Illinois and radical labor politics. When coal mining was big here, the Communist Party had a substantial presence in Southern Illinois in the 1930s.
Right.
And when the Black Panther House was shot up in 1970 by the police in Carbondale, and the Panthers were brought up on charges, an all-white jury in Murfreesboro sided with the Black Panthers, right?
Wow.
So it's a contradictory place with like a history of class conscience and a history of lynchings,
Right.
Including lynchings of like German immigrants,
Right.
For not being enthusiastic about World War I, but also a history of class struggle. And the university here was a multiracial university in the 1800s. Like, it was admitting, I think, black male students within a couple years and black women within like 5 or 6 years of the university opening. So it's a huge contradiction around here. I think the big, like, because there's an old joke, the United States isn't really a country. It's 50 countries that are kind of third world countries in a trench coat. And the trench coat is like the Pentagon and atomic bombs and everything else. Illinois is a blue state, which means it's relatively liberal. There are still rights for trans people here. There's still abortion rights. There's still, even the billionaire liberal governor will negotiate with unions. He'll screw them over, but he'll negotiate like a civilized capitalist, right? I think it depends how much of an escalation there is with things like the federal police forces that Trump is trying to develop.
Right.
Right now they're focused on California to some degree and rounding up particularly people of color. But they are going to expand it, and they're expanding it to basically expand the suspension of habeas corpus on mental health grounds, not just on you're not born here grounds. This stuff's not formal, so it depends on how the fascist tendencies escalate. Right now, I think we're safe, and people are moving here to be safe, but it's basically a laboratory of fascism in places like Florida and Texas. It's not safe to be queer. It's not safe to be an immigrant. It's not even safe maybe to be a naturalized U.S. citizen in some of these places. So it's very uneven. It's in this way, it's similar to some of the stuff in India, where it's uneven from state to state and location to location, how bad the reaction is, how big the threat is. We won't probably be the first people if that all comes here to be, because that's the last thing I want to say about this. And we were talking to Holly Lewis about this, the class stuff. We're anti-racist, we're pro-queer, we're like all these things, but the class stuff's not that controversial. Like, even some of the people who are total reactive, like if you talk about it, we should have unions. They were betrayed. One of the reasons they turned right is this used to be a Democratic Party area, even though it was conservative, because of the unions. And they were betrayed by the Democratic Party and the economy over the last 40 years. It's similar to some of the class realignment stuff. in Britain in some of the post-industrial areas.
Yeah.
But I want to emphasize, it's not usually the working class people in these small towns voting Trump.
Yeah.
It's the middle class people who own the town.
Yep.
You know, most of the working class people just don't vote because why would you? You know, vote for this asshole or that. They're both going to screw you over. And you're exhausted and
yeah. No, I think that's one of the things that's good about some of the projects that you do is that it does focus in on class politics, which is a void that mainstream Democrats in the US and Labour here in the UK have maybe left open for more reactionary forces. So, you know, it's good to have that alignment, I think. How about, I mean, we touched on the Palestine question briefly there. How have you both kind of approached this as artists and writers? I know you've got a piece coming up on the Revol blog, Adam, which sort of touches on this a little bit. Has it been something that you felt the need to speak out on, to find a way of putting into your work?
I mean, I personally try to, I mean, I guess I in terms of representation, I haven't like specifically written about Palestinian people. I've, you know, said things on social media, but in terms of like the things that I'm creating, I guess I've just kind of kept in mind and tried to use the anger that I feel there to let that inform the kinds of things that I'm writing and what I'm writing. Mostly in terms of Palestine, it's just a struggle to not be so enraged by it that I'm like unable to do anything. It's just constantly wrestling with not being paralyzed by it, because it really is so horrific to look at. And I'm not going to not look at it, obviously, but it's so difficult to look at that it obviously can be really paralyzing. It can make it difficult to make work. It can make it difficult to think about anything other than just how awful everything is right now.
On the practical, like the practical politics level, our chapter has been involved in multiple protests, and there's a Palestinian and Muslim community here that overlaps. It's not identical. And there's been student protests and attempts to build an encampment here that had a problem and so on. But we also focused in on our city council. We had our chapter of DSA had endorsed a candidate for the city council who won. And she had pledged as part of our endorsement to support Palestinian liberation. This is before October 7th. When October 7th came around, so we go to the city council meeting and we start talking about we need to have a resolution for a ceasefire. We didn't expect, you know, the city council to pass something as radical as what we would want, that would squarely place the blame on colonialism and Zionism, but we wanted a call. Israel is the aggressor, really the aggressor here. We need a ceasefire. Because, and this was pretty quickly in the process of the escalating genocide of the last almost 2 years now. And she sort of split the difference and didn't push it. And our comrades and our Muslim and Arab neighbors were called terrorists by members of the city council. And we had people arrested at the city council meeting in violation of the law. And we were, you know, gaslit that law didn't exist, even though we researched it. Of course, after they arrested and we filed a complaint with the state, all of a sudden the charges were dropped because we were right. But they hemmed and hawed and demonized, you know, the people who cared about the genocide as terrorists and everything else. That was a long campaign. It kept things, we were trying to build up the critical mass, like, of turning opinion where we could, you know, and hopefully that would happen in other places before we got to the point where Israel looks like it's reaching its version of the final solution in Gaza. And we're still involved in solidarity and protest, but now, of course, it's difficult because some folks in the most affected communities are under the gun from the other terrible things the federal government is doing. So there's a tendency for people who aren't natural-born U.S. citizens to not feel like they can use their voice after you know, what's been going on. Palestine's always been really, the first petition I ever signed when I was 12 years old was a petition to get Israel out of the occupied territories. I was going through the student center, and some Palestine solidarity activists, Arab Muslim students were petitioning. They explained how it was like South Africa. I knew a lot about South Africa from my father, who cared about that issue because he'd been involved in the civil rights movement in the United States. I'm not saying he was like a leader or anything, but he was part of like desegregation stuff at his seminary and stuff like that. It was in the anti-war movement during Vietnam. So I was part of the protests that happened during the Second Intifada and right before 9/11. The mass protests around Palestine, part of groups arguing that Palestine not be forgotten when we were protesting the Iraq War, stuff like that. So it's been important to me the whole time. I am very well aware in terms of when it comes to art and culture of what our comrade Anupam Roy calls the impossibility of representation.
Right.
This often gets discussed in less productive ways, is like you're co-opting other people's struggles, or like that isn't necessarily helpful all the time, because like white American artists should talk, for example, about slavery, because it's not really a black person. The problem was it was white people, right? So you should talk about it, but you have to think about how you do that, right? You have to be very familiar with the historic voices and subjectivities, both individual and collective, of who you're talking about. You have to realize that it's impossible to truly represent the lived experience that you don't have. That doesn't mean generalization is impossible or that Marxism is wrong, but you have to the phenomenology of being oppressed is specific, right? And so you have to be conscious of that. So that's one of the reasons for a realism for us. Like, you go to the protests, be in solidarity, do whatever we can, argue about the strength, all that. But like in terms of representing it, you have to think through how that gets translated narratively or symbolically into artwork in a way that doesn't just recapitulate trauma, because a lot of the or whitewash it. Right. So those are a lot of the problems when this stuff gets put in. If you look at like the TV show Andor, there's a genocide that happens. There's fictional people called the Gorman or whatever, and everybody sees that and they hate it, rightly so. To what extent is that a sublation of the actual genocide that's happening? And there's other things happening, but the sort of clear example that exists in Palestine. To what extent is that a sublation? Does it actually help people think critically about the genocide that's happening now? And that's a mixed bag, and there's questions to be asked about. Does it aestheticize it? And I'm not saying it necessarily does, but these are problems that I think you have to think through as an artist or a writer, where you're not just aestheticizing or recapitulating trauma, that you're providing the criticality, that you're providing the rebellion, the rupture. You're thinking through how to incorporate that into the work you did. I have done a couple pieces that get at, because I think this is where I can represent the American complicity in the genocide, right? Which is really right there with Israel's. Like representing, like I took a Goya piece that shows war as a colossus, and I put an Uncle Sam hat on it. And then had like From the River to the Sea under it, which is partly a sort of riffing on a Sister Wife sex strike song that compares the colonialism of Israel, and I think at least one of them is Jewish anti-Zionist. Because the colonial renaming of things in Israel to the colonialism of renaming things in the United States. So From the River to the Sea, which sea are we talking about? Is what I was getting at in that one piece.
Yeah. Another way you tie it in your forthcoming piece for Revel is to talk about this figure of the lone gunman as sort of like a meme or a recurring trope in discourse about America. I mean, that made me think, a little bit about political violence in America as well, and the way that like there's increased amounts of mass shootings happening, and in a way, you can sort of start to lose touch with the ways in which those are political acts as well. Can you unpack a little bit for me, like what you're talking about there with that lone gunman figure and how that relates to American culture and American overseas power?
Well, I think that there's the period of colonial settlement. It's actually several periods of colonial settlement of the United States. The There's the initial period with the 13 colonies, and then the Revolutionary War, and then there's the westward expansion, which has this very uneven and complicated history, because the U.S. government wanted the pretense that they weren't stealing land as they stole it, right? So it gets very complicated. But basically, there's a process of ethnic cleansing, genocide that unfolds over decades of westward expansion in the United States. And then at the same time, up until the end of the Civil War, you have chattel slavery in the U.S. South. And of course, the big fight and what produces the Civil War is a fight over the expansion of slavery to this colonized land to the West. Both require lots of armed people that aren't necessarily the state, right? So there's some good scholarship about this. I'm forgetting her name right now, who wrote a whole thing on the Second Amendment, how it's not really about, workers and peasants being armed or something. It's about the militias that are being used to enforce slavery and to carry out westward expansion have the right to bear arms. So you have this kind of violence built into the fabric of 19th century America. And you could forget about that to some degree, in New York or Boston or Baltimore, especially New York and Boston, where slavery becomes illegal very quickly. And you start to have the trappings of, bourgeois democracy very early. In the Northeast, universal male suffrage expands pretty rapidly after the American Revolution, even before you get it in Britain. But in the South, there's not universal male suffrage even for white people, and definitely not for black people, and so on. There's all this violence built in to the expansion of the United States. And then in the late 1800s, that violence expands to colonialism as the United States becomes an imperial power like the rest of Europe, much of Europe, with the Spanish-American War, the U.S. occupation of the Philippines, Cuba, Puerto Rico, and so on. And there's more opportunities for people with guns to make a living, to do something. And it's built into the fabric of the country. And then, of course, that expands again after World War II as the United States becomes the default capitalist imperial power in the world. But what we see with the decline of the U.S. empire, and this is sort of one of the things I'm getting at, is those avenues for men with guns to enrich themselves and find a role, a celebrity, is diminished greatly, because the U.S. empire is folding in on itself probably more quickly than people can imagine. I'm for that, of course, as a leftist, although I'm also very worried about the form it will take. I think about when Britain lost its empire, the working class got universal health care. I don't think it's going to go that way here. And I think part of the sort of lone gunman thing is that violence being indiscriminately turned back in on the homeland, right? Imperial violence always comes home, but it's coming home in this very individualistic American idiom. And one of the things that inspired me to write that is like, there's a danger of, just like online, there's a danger of enacting anti-capitalism in a capitalist way by competing with other people to be the best anti-capitalist in this neoliberal idiom. I think there's a possibility for violence to be that way too. That's not a viable strategy, and it's also very much a reflection of the colonial violence and history of the United States, I think. And I tied it up to the question of ghosts because there's all these political ghosts that have come back. History was supposed to end. The neoliberals told us it didn't, and now all the ghosts are being resurrected, but nobody's sure which ghosts are the right ghosts. So you can find socialists of every kind, in the DSA in the United States, almost every single tendency in history. You can find anarchists of every sort. You can find on the right different fascists of every kind. And we have to figure out, without much time, which ghosts we want to have a seance with. I don't want to kill the metaphor too much. But some demons are dark. What's the Melissa Carper song? Some aliens are good.
Oh yeah.
Some aliens are bad. Don't let the bad ones take you away.
Don't let the bad ones pretend to be. Sometimes the bad ones pretend to be good.
Yeah. Melissa Carper, a country singer from Arkansas, I think. Originally.
So.
She's really good. Yeah. She's got a great song called "My Christian Girlfriend."
Oh yeah. Yeah.
Maybe we can embed that in the post as a little end song for people checking out the episode. But no, definitely recommend everybody listening to the show to check out that essay from Adam, which is forthcoming on the Revol Press blog. I think there's some really salient points there about the way that political violence is changing, the dangers that might arise from the political conditions that have produced mass shooters, like mass casualty incidents, people driving into protests with their cars. I think Adam's got some really interesting stuff to say about that, so definitely check out the essay.
I'm not a pacifist, but I'm against random acts of
strategic acts of violence.
I'm not saying that. I just said I'm not a pacifist.
Sorry.
I'm against stupid shit.
Okay.
Yeah. Great. I mean, we did touch briefly there on the DSA, and I know that you're involved with your local chapter. Obviously, no political organization is perfect, and like you were kind of alluding to there are different types of socialist within the DSA. What are your kind of pluses and negatives of being involved with that at the moment, and maybe what are your hopes for the influence that the DSA could bring in the next round of elections when they do come around?
My big plus for the DSA is just that I think that it's really, really important for there to be a big multi-tendency organization. As leftists, if we're not willing and able to argue and actually come to conclusions with ourselves, what the fuck are we doing? It's just a mental exercise and you're playing and you're not actually serious right now, right? So that's what I really like, is that you get that a lot of the time. Honestly, my big negative with the DSA is just sort of the I think over-reliance on how to make the meetings go smoothly without actually giving much of a shit about the content of the meeting. And that's where I'll just leave that. Maybe that's more my DSA experience than a general DSA experience. But yeah, I just think I think it's really important. And I think that a lot of what it's doing relies on the fact that a lot of the best things that it's doing relies on the fact that it is a multi-tendency organization that is willing to have arguments and to figure things out.
Yeah.
Do you have some faith that it can build some momentum towards the next opportunity to get Trump out of office?
I really feel like we actually have kind of a unique moment now where we can, because I feel like people are really painfully aware in this moment, both of the failures of the right, but also the failures of the left.
The official left.
The official left, the liberals, I should say, the failures of the liberals. Because, I mean, what are they going to do about anything? Just keep Cory Bookering about it and AOCing about it, right? Like, are you just going to smile at the camera and say the things you're supposed to say and then vote the way that you're officially supposed to vote? And that means giving more money to Israel, even though you're saying you're not going to do that. So I think that the more both sides fail, obviously the worse it's going to get for all of us, but also the more uniquely able we are to reach out and offer solidarity to one another, which is the thing that's actually going to be the final deciding factor, I think, in whether or not we as a working class can do anything good. But I also think that the DSA is probably actually able to seize that in a way that other organizations aren't.
The DSA has lost a number of members over the last few years, partly because of what you were describing. There's what's good about it is that there's, unlike the Leninist sects that existed, that still existed out of the 60s and 70s, you don't have to pass a litmus test to be in the group. So there can be more democratic discussion. The tendency is that tends to get sort of focused on small tasks and bureaucratic details. Mm-hmm. And part of that's a hangover from what it was before. It had a mass influx of people in 2016, but there's still probably 20-some thousand active people and tens of thousands more on paper, which makes it the largest socialist thing in the U.S. since the 70s, probably. And it's split between a left, right, and center. And I tend to agree with the people on the left on focus on mass organizing, trying to organize unions, anti-racist struggles, that not that elections aren't important. And when it comes to elections, I probably agree mostly with the Reformer Revolution Caucus that is arguing that we need to move the DSA toward being an actual political party. Not declare it right now, like as if we could magically declare a party like so many people have done before and it didn't work, but take concrete steps towards doing that. Because the Democratic Party, they're sabotaging their candidate for mayor of New York City.
Right. Because
they are so hostile to even moderate reforms. And part of this makes sense because since everything is privatized in the United States, pretty much, and even moderate reforms become existential threats to sections of capital, right? So, for example, like most of the other wealthy countries, and probably even a majority of developing countries, have some kind of universal health care, right? Like there's universal health care in Mexico. There's we don't here. It would be a minor reform to put that into place. However, it would threaten a multi-billion-dollar industry,
right?
Hundreds of billions of dollars of capital. It would be the largest transfer of wealth in the U.S. since the end of slavery, and that took a war. That took 600,000 people dying and the destruction of Atlanta and so on. So I tend to agree with the left of DSA. We need to move towards forming our own party. Not declare it tomorrow, like we can just do it out of thin air, but try to win over the rest of DSA to realizing we can't reform the Democrats. Doesn't mean I don't want Mamdani to win in New York, but I do. But I'm also aware that there's going to be a huge fight that won't be won just by, if he wins, to get the minor reforms, there needs to probably be strikes, across New York City, and things like that. Now, housing, I totally agree. Like the failure of the center and the fact the right is now being exposed as not actually producing anything of substance. And in fact, we might be entering a pretty substantial recession or worse, partly born of the tariffs, but also born of possible international capital flight from the United States. I don't know if you saw Trump fired the Bureau of Labor Statistics head. This is a problem for Wall Street, not because they care about labor, but because the key thing with Wall Street, right, is that they have accurate numbers. So if there's not even accurate numbers and you can't trust the good faith of the currency of the United States, there's all these problems that could lead to a huge, huge crises. I think the question is whether we can seize on and do the patient work we need to create an actual labor party or socialist labor party in the United States in time to minimize as much damage as will happen. We have more raw human material to build that than we have had in decades. Right. But whether that's enough, whether the ghosts can get up to speed in time for, they're figuring out legal ways to rig the midterms. And I don't know if you're following. Anyway, I don't have the answer to that. I know that it's better to be with the folks who are trying to do. That's why I'm not in Reformer Revolution, the caucus, but I sympathize with them a lot. And I have one of our fellow editors at Locust is part of their caucus. And I think is the delegate to the convention happening this weekend from Olympia. Yep. And then our delegates are chapter chair here to the convention. And there's a number of fights happening about all these questions there, also on Palestine and anti-racist work and so on.
So, yeah, it's interesting. I mean, it really sounds like there's a lot of potential there, but also, like you say, a ticking clock on a lot of things. And it's that question of like when you seize the moment, I guess. Well, this has been a fascinating conversation, folks. I mean, I before we wrap up, I wonder, we haven't talked a lot about your book, Adam. Could you give us for listeners who haven't checked out the Revo website and had a look at the Gothic capitalism, can you give us the elevator pitch for what the book is about?
All right, it sort of deals with, let's say, three things. One, there's this Gothic aspect to capitalist culture that's related to the uneven and combined development of the economic system. So, people struggle, they win reforms, they win a decent life maybe through unions or beating back certain aspects of racism or heterosexism. You carve out a town where, there's gay rights and my grandpa's in the union and, he can buy a house and, and that stuff gets eroded and destroyed by the constant flux of capitalism. And so we're surrounded by these Gothic ruins, the biggest one of which is, as Mark Fisher talked about, the idea that there's an alternative, the mass belief that it doesn't have to be like capitalism, it can be something else. And then so when we're dealing with culture and capitalism, we have to deal with this contradictory relationship to time, that it isn't just a telos of progress and things get better, and it isn't just that things were worse in the past. The past is both horror and nostalgia. The future is both promise and threat, right? So that's one. And then two, that idea that everything around our cultural work is part of its meaning. So if we believe in anti-capitalism, socialism, or whatever, also if we want our art to have a social meaning and an existential meaning, unlike a lot of what's produced by what I call the weak avant-garde, which we sort of touched on earlier, we have to reassociate it with some kind of social performance, the social ensemble, and try to recapitulate some kind of belief. And then the third thing is, this is also true of like the cybernetic aspect of our lives. It's true of the art world, but it's also true of like our social performances online. And that is sort of a total art of capitalism. So we have to think of some sort of beginning to create some sort of counter to that, a counter montage, where it's our voices, but also everybody else's who's objectively and hopefully more soon subjectively opposed to the way this system is set up. There's a lot of details in there about Silicon Valley, about racism being encoded into our algorithms, about specific artists like Emory Douglas, who's the artist, the Minister of Culture for the Black Panther Party, and Ilya and Amelia Kabakov, the dissident Soviet artists, and so on, that I think get at some of the, and Brecht, the playwright, Benjamin, as well, to get at like how all this stuff works. And I would say the thread going there is my belief that art is social, but it's also spiritual, lowercase s. It's not just didactic propaganda or just empty signs that mean something. It's also poetry and expression and all this stuff. So buy my book. If you plus 1,000 other people buy it, I can maybe retire soon.
Fantastic. Well, listen, it's been absolutely fascinating speaking to both of you and hearing a little bit about the roots of the various projects you're involved in. I really enjoyed your book, Adam. I'm probably sounding biased to my readers because everyone knows I work for Revol now as well. But it's one of the ones that I really enjoyed working on a little bit, and yeah, just great to get to speak to you about all of that stuff.
I like your book too. Sometimes we should talk about the inspiration for the title to your book.
It comes from an episode of Community.
Right. I know.
I'll send you the meme.
I got laid off right when Community started, and I went back to college. So I over-identified with that show. I was like, oh, it's. I mean, I don't. But I'm not the character, but the situation. And I love that show.
Oh, great. Well, listen, thank you for coming on the show. Thank you for sharing so much of your time with me. And, good luck with all of the projects as well. I will obviously put some links to the Born Again Labor Museum, Locust Review, and to Adam's book into the show notes. If you have anything to add there, let me know. I can add a few links. But yeah, thank you very much for joining me on Strange Exiles.
Thanks for having me.